Ladies and gentlemen, we are here at the reenactment of one of the most historical battles that took place in Poland. The battle known as Orszynka Grochowska took place 188 years ago, and it was what ultimately stopped the Russians from taking over Warsaw. In the year 1795, Poland was partitioned by three of its neighbors, Russia, Prussia, and Austria. They were wiped out of the map of Europe, but almost 30 years later, they rise up against the Russian forces in what otherwise known as the November Uprising. Thanks to this very battle, the Poles managed to stop the Russians from invading Warsaw, taking over the capital, and potentially spare the lives of thousands of civilians.
Many Poles fought on the side of France during the Napoleonic Wars. As a result, the French set up a semi-independent state called the Duchy of Warsaw in 1807. After Napoleon's defeat at Waterloo and the 1815 Congress of Vienna, Russia took control over Warsaw again. However, one of the provisions of the Congress of Vienna stipulated that the semi-autonomous status of the Duchy of Warsaw would remain in the new Russian satellite state known as the Congress Kingdom. The Polish Congress Kingdom was allowed to have its own constitution, one of the most liberal in Europe of the time. But a couple of years after the Vienna Congress, the Russian Tsar started ignoring the constitution. As a consequence, the Poles decided to revolt against the Russian Empire in 1830, an event which became known as the November Uprising.
As we know, the November Uprising did not only significantly influence Poland, but also other countries as well. And we know that it's significantly linked to the establishment of the Belgian state. And I was hoping you can elaborate a little bit more about it.
Jeżeli mówimy o wiośnie ludów w 1848, to musimy powiedzieć o przedwiośniu.
When we want to talk about the 1848 Spring of Nations, we need to mention the pre-spring period of the year 1830. It began with the July Revolution in Paris. It lasted only 2 days. The Bourbon dynasty was overthrown and Louis-Philippe of the Orleans dynasty was made king. The revolution then moved to Brussels in August, completely by accident. A Paris theatre troupe came to Brussels to perform La Meute des Poésies, an opera with a beautiful song about freedom. It just so happened that the song came from the opera to the streets. People started singing it and it turned into a full-blown revolution. The song fit perfectly with the emotions brewing up inside the Catholic community in the Netherlands Kingdom, which didn't want to be a part of Holland. We should remember that the Netherlands were a Calvinist country and the Catholics had seemingly no rights. On August 26, 1830, the Belgian Revolution broke out. After a few weeks, the Belgians gathered their parliament, and on October 4th, they declared independence. They cut off their ties with the United Kingdom of Netherlands entirely. I should add that the King of Holland was soon to be William II of the Netherlands, who got married with the sister of Tsar Alexander I. They were family, hence the brother-in-law of the Russian Tsar could ask Alexander I for help in dealing with the Belgians, which he did. And indeed, in the middle of November, there was an announcement in the press that the whole Congress army, meaning the Poles forced to serve in the Russian army, was to be ready to march. The only thing left to do was for the Russians to negotiate with the Prussians to let the army pass through their country to the Belgian border to defeat the revolution. It was clear from the beginning that the revolution will be supported by France, where it came from. It meant that Poles, who for a brief moment regained some independence fighting alongside Napoleon Bonaparte, would be forced to stand against the French army. And that was something that the Poles couldn't bear. They said that it would be below their honor, that being enslaved is tragic, but to bring enslavement to other nations would be even worse. They thought it was better to die in their own country than fight battles in Waterloo once again, but on the wrong side. Thanks to Poles, another battle in Belgium didn't take place, and for that the Belgians were very grateful. They immediately hired around 150 Polish officers, and for almost 10 years their supreme commander was a Pole, Jan Skrzynecki. He wasn't the greatest commander in history, but he was a good organizer. Belgium didn't engage in any other conflict during that time, but they still had a very well-organized army. Even in the interwar period between 1918 and 1939, the Belgians were sending a delegation to lay wreaths in front of the tomb of the unknown soldier. What's more, during the time of the Solidarity struggle against the communists, I myself saw a delegation of 2 buses from Liège and Brussels who laid wreaths as token of gratitude for the fact that Poles were able to stand by the Belgian Revolution and not allow the Tsar to force them to take away someone's freedom. We were simply brothers.
Zmusić do zdławienia czyjejś wolności. Byliśmy po prostu braćmi.
As Russia came out victorious in the Napoleonic Wars, a huge Russian army occupied Paris. In the decades after Congress of Vienna, Europe lived in fear of Russia sending its large armies to quell uprisings across Europe. Russia had, in effect, become the policeman of Europe.
There's a great distance between the border of Russia and Belgium, and they really went a long way. I was wondering if that's a common practice that the Russians enact during the time, or is it like a special occasion?
Trzeba pamiętać, że Rosją rządziła dynastia niemiecka.
We need to remember that Russia was actually ruled by a German dynasty. It was the House of Oldenburg dynasty, also called Holstein-Gottorp. It was only in their tradition that they called themselves Romanov, interestingly written in an English or French way with 2 Fs. This dynasty couldn't even speak Russian for a long time. It was said that the Empress Catherine the Great could only swear well in that language. In everyday life, she mainly spoke French, which was the language of the aristocracy, or in German, which was her native language. Her son and grandchildren the same. Tsar Alexander spoke better in Polish than in Russian. Only Nicholas was a true Russian. Nonetheless, the smaller German states were really afraid that the Russian forces would invade them, except for the ones closer to the sea and the British fleet. At that time, the so-called Great Game was beginning, with the British operating in the sea and the Russians operating on land. Even still, all the 36 German states, kingdoms in Italy, France or Switzerland, which was invaded by the Russian army of General Suvorov in the end of the 18th century, or France, which had Russian forces on its territory for 3 years, were all well aware that the Russians could attack them in the future. So in July 1830 we had the July Revolution in Paris, in August in Brussels the Belgian Revolution, and in September there was the revolution in Dresden and the Saxony declares its constitution. Then in October there was a revolution in Bautzen or Budyszyn and the Lusatians declared their constitution, which allowed them to speak the Lusatian language. Finally, in November there was our uprising, the November Uprising, which took Russia out of the European political scene for more than a year. Suddenly, Europe had a chance to breathe and feel free after the threat of the Russian army looming above. We need to remember that no one could really oppose Russia at that time. It had 500,000 soldiers and 600 cannons. A united Europe was needed in order to stand a chance against Russia, and the European countries realized that they could do so if Poles were to take the first strike. That's why, after the uprising fell, Poles were welcomed with such kindness by the Germans. It was one of the few rare examples of Polish-German friendship, and to this day it remained so in some parts of Germany where Poles are liked and respected, for example in Baden or Saxony. There, Poles are often welcomed with sympathy. Even Wagner wrote a beautiful symphony about Poland, so the fact that Poles organized the uprising was often mentioned in gratitude in Europe. Another example of this is the story of Joachim Lelevel, the greatest leader of the Democrats and the member of the insurgent national government, who after the uprising found shelter in Brussels as an honorary guest. They called him a loner from Brussels. All this shows how Europe was thankful for the November uprising, although unable to aid it in the end.
Świadczy o tym, że Europa doceniła powstanie listopadowe, chociaż nie była mu w stanie dopomóc.
As we can observe, the memories of the historical battles are still kept alive and well, even centuries after the battles have taken place. Clearly, the struggle for national sovereignty is still a key value within the Polish collective memory. That's it for today. I'm your host, Benjamin Lee. I'll see you next time on Poland Daily History.